Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's NAC at Home program. My name is David Zyla. For those of you who are not familiar with the National Arts Club, we're a 501c3 nonprofit arts club based in New York City with a mission to stimulate, foster, and promote public interest in the arts and to educate the American people in the fine arts. Annually, the club offers more than 150 free programs to the public, including exhibitions, theatrical and musical performances, lectures, and exhibits, and readings as well. For more information about the National Arts Club, you can visit us at nationalartsclub.org or find us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. Following our conversation, we will have a brief Q&A, so feel free to use the chat or Q&A function for any questions you might have. So today we are extraordinarily excited to be joined by Erica Holst. And let me tell you a little bit about her. Erica Holst is the curator of history at the Illinois State Museum. Her most recent exhibition, currently on view at the Lockport location, is Fashioning Illinois, 1820 to 1900, a collection of 19th century clothing worn by Illinois women. Holst has worked in the public history field for more than 15 years, during which time she has curated more than a dozen exhibits. Her 2013 exhibition, Hidden in Plain Sight, The Material World of Early Springfield, won the Illinois State Historical Society's Award for Superior Achievement. She is passionate about telling the story of people and history through material culture. Before joining the Illinois State Museum, Erica served as curator of collections at the historic Edwards Place in Springfield, Illinois. She oversaw the complete renovation of the historic house to its 1850s appearance. Her publications include Wicked Springfield, Crime, Corruption, and Scandal during the Lincoln Era, Edwards Place, A Springfield Treasure, and Historic Houses of Lincoln's, Illinois, as well as several scholarly and popular articles. She holds a master's degree from the Winter Third program in Early American Culture. Erica Holst, welcome.
Thank you so much, David. It's good to be back. I'm excited to share this story. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen right now. Okay, so this is a story that has bi-state appeal. You're in New York, I'm in Illinois, and this happens to be a story of a 19th century woman who was raised in New York and moved to Illinois. So there's a little something for everyone. It's also a story that has some appeal for the recent Halloween holiday that we passed, because it begins with kind of a ghost story. So it all began for me when I was doing research on the Fashioning Illinois exhibition that you just mentioned, and I needed a 19th century white wedding dress with Illinois provenance to display in the exhibit. And this was a leading contender, this gorgeous 1850s wedding gown. And this was all I knew about it. Worn about 1850 by Carolyn Sutherland, daughter of Samuel Sutherland, Chatham Center, New York. She married K.L. Layton and lived in Rockford, Illinois. So far, so good. We've got a white wedding dress with an Illinois provenance. So I'll give you a little secret about my research techniques here as a curator. The very first thing I do when I'm researching anything before I hit, an archives or a research library, I do a quick old Google search. I just put it in quotations and hit Google. And so I looked up Carolyn Sutherland, Chatham Center, New York. And this was my first hit, Haunted Catskills. And there was a chapter about Carolyn Sutherland, and this is how it started off. Her body was found in the crypt with two other coffins. Hers was cast iron with an 8x10 window. When the glass was cleaned, people saw a beautiful young woman dressed in a bridal gown, holding a rose in her right hand over her breast. The metal coffin contained the remains of Mrs. Carolyn Sutherland Layton. The book went on to say that residents in Chatham Center say that sometimes they've seen a young lady in a white bridal gown walking through local fields. So the most pressing research inquiry at the top of my mind after this is now, of course, is there a ghost wedding dress in the collection? How can she have been buried in this wedding dress and be walking around in a ghostly form in her wedding dress? So let's dig into the research now. So this is what we knew about the wedding dress, that it had belonged to Caroline Sutherland. We've got some major gaps in knowledge. We know that Robert and Helen Brown Wells had donated it to Illinois State University, who transferred it to the Illinois State Museum in 1993. But some major voids in our knowledge, including how did this dress that was worn by a woman who was raised in New York and moved to Rockford, Illinois, find its way to central Illinois? So now it's time to dig into the real research. We've done the Google bit, and the first place I went to was the census. And lo and behold, I did see Samuel Sutherland and a Caroline Sutherland in the 1850 census for New York. But look at what's going on with the ages there. Samuel Sutherland is listed at age 24. He's living with a Mary, who's 21, a Maria, who's 45, and there's our Caroline, who's 15. But Samuel, who's 24, is not Caroline's father. And so what's going on here is that Samuel is her brother, and her mother, who's third down the list there, is widowed, and she's got her son and daughter-in-law and daughter living in her household, but because it's the 19th century, she's not considered the head of the household. She's considered third down the list, and Samuel is considered the head of the household. So this kind of knowing who Caroline's father was and wasn't lets us crack the code a little bit more. We know that Maria Sutherland was her mother, and this allows us to determine that her father was actually a Dr. John Sutherland, who died in 1842. Maria and brother Samuel ended up moving from New York to McLean County, Illinois, where Illinois State University is located at some point in the mid-19th century. So this solves one problem for us. Now we've got a chain of custody, and doing a little digging, my second favorite website behind just a plain Google site is Find a Grave. If anyone's ever looked at it, it's kind of like Facebook for dead people. It lists people by their burial location, and often very helpfully it will link them to their parents or children or siblings, so you can kind of click backwards and discover who's related to who. So doing that, we discover that Caroline Sutherland Layton probably gave her dress wound up in the possession of her brother Samuel and sister-in-law Mary Sutherland. Their child Anna Sutherland Brown passed it on to her daughter Helen Brown Wells, and Helen or her husband Robert transferred it to Illinois State University and then to the Illinois State Museum. So this is about as far as I got, and here's where I caught an incredibly lucky break. The Illinois State Museum sadly does not have an ancestry subscription, but I have a guy. I've got a volunteer who has an ancestry subscription, and I contacted this gentleman and said, I have some research work for you to do. I need you to tell me everything you can find about Caroline Sutherland Layton and her family. And he did me one better. He put this query out onto Ancestry and connected with one of Caroline's descendants. And that descendant said, I'd be happy to talk. I know about her. And more than that, I'll hold on to the second thing she said for a little bit. I'll tell you the background information first, and then I'll tell you the big reveal. She was able to provide a photograph, which is amazing because remember, our ghost story started with this image of this beautiful woman's face in the vault. So if you can picture an 1850s burial casket and this woman's perfectly preserved face staring up at you, this is what got everything started. So Caroline Sutherland Layton was born in 1831 in New York, and she died in 1855 in Rockford, Illinois. And as we had determined, she was the daughter of a prosperous doctor, and she and her brother were lavished with attention and had all the, fine things in life. Caroline was sent to the Troy Female Seminary for school, along with daughters of other prominent and prosperous families of the New York area. And this higher education institution is the first one for girls that gave them a curriculum that was on par with a boys' college education. Women went to this institution and they were taught mathematics, science, history, foreign language, and literature. And one of their most famous alumna is Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And so one of the points of this institution was to prepare women for the next step in their lives. And for most of these women being well off, this doesn't mean going into a profession. That wasn't really an option for women. It meant that they would be better prepared to be wives and mothers. They would be able to be intellectual counterparts to their husband, and perhaps even more importantly, they were poised to raise the next generation of well-educated, civic-minded Americans. So there's this idea of Republican motherhood underpinning this. So Caroline, having had the benefit of this education, was a very intellectual woman. She had broader views and a deeper exposure to ideas and knowledge than most women of her time. So she grew to be a belle of Chatham Center, and she probably could have had her pick of any number of suitors, but the man she married was named John Layton, and he is a complete blank. We know nothing about him. We haven't even found him in the historical record, aside from the fact that he married Caroline, which is sort of unusual. Usually it's flipped, and a man at least merits some kind of passing biographical notice, and the woman is the footnote. But in our case, Caroline is at the forefront of our knowledge. Her husband is just a name. We don't know where he came from, how old he was, what he did for a living. All we know is that they were married on June 13th, 1854, and that he took his new bride to live in Rockford, Illinois. And this was a common thing for young couples just starting out at the time. Illinois boasted a lot of cheap farmland that was available. It was a western state. It was a good place for the second sons, the ones who weren't going to inherit the family farm or the family fortune, to go out and kind of make their way in the world. So at age 23, this newlywed Caroline goes out to Rockford, Illinois. She's halfway across the country from her mother and brother and everything that's familiar for her. And sadly, she died in childbirth in 1855, just a year after she was married. 11 days after her death, the baby girl that she gave birth to died as well. And according to the descendant that we spoke to, her mother had come from New York to be with Caroline as she was drawing near to the end of her pregnancy, presumably to help her daughter out in this time with the new baby. And sadly, her mother ended up staying for her daughter's funeral in Illinois and packing up all her belongings and the body of her daughter and granddaughter and transporting them back to New York, where she had a second funeral and was buried in the family burying ground. And so this explains the burial casket that she was in. A Fisk burial casket, or a cast iron burial casket, was one that was meant to preserve the features and be an airtight seal so that family members could give their relatives a proper goodbye and to have that closure of being able to see them one more time. This was the era of the good death, where death was all around people. Maternal mortality rates were super high. 1 in 100 births resulted in the death of a mother. And so people expected death. And one of the ways that they coped with it was to try to give their relative a good death. And a good death was considered one where the dying person made peace with their impending mortality. They made peace with their creator. They showed their family that they were at peace and ready to move on. The family was present and able to say goodbye. And so with Caroline being in Illinois, most of her family members, her brother and sister-in-law, and any other close friends or aunts or uncles, didn't have that chance. Caroline's mother did have that chance to say goodbye to her, but by taking her back to New York in a glass-faced coffin, that would give the rest of her loved ones a chance to at least say goodbye to her. And so this is where she was entombed, the family vault. Her father was the first occupant when he passed away in 1842. James was her father's brother, who's noted there at the top of the vault. And this is where that story picks up from the ghost book that we started with. Carolyn's story wasn't quite done with her entombment because in 1936, the front of the vault caved in and the occupants kind of were brought to light again. There was a little boy who was sort of poking around in the woods and saw this grave or tomb with an open door and went in and beheld Carolyn's perfectly preserved face. And it was considered almost a miracle. Like, why is this body so perfectly preserved? And she's lovely. And how romantic is that? So in 1936, for several days running, people would troop out to the family burial grounds, which was on private land. It was on a private farm at that point. And they would take their flashlights or their candles, and they would all kind of stream out and look at Carolyn's face. And then rumors started to circulate. People were talking about, well, you know, is someone going to try to steal her wedding ring? Is someone going to try to steal the corpse and place it on public view and charge people money to see it? So finally the sheriff had to get involved, and he had to cordon off the area, and eventually Carolyn and the bodies of her infant daughter and her father and uncle were taken and buried in a new location where they could have their final peace. We still got a couple lingering questions about this, though. First of all, was Carolyn buried in her wedding dress? The story and the kind of oral tradition of people who saw her in her casket, people said bridal clothes, wedding dress. However, I've got a wedding dress in my collection with the tradition that it came from Caroline Sutherland. So what's the real story here? So I believe that we do have the wedding dress, and that Carolyn was buried in a shroud. And a shroud was a 19th century type of burial garment. And it mimics everyday clothing. Often it was white. The difference is that it's looser. It's easier to put on a body. It's got looser sleeves. Oftentimes it ties in the back. These shrouds sometimes were made by women when they were preparing for their wedding and put in their trousseau in anticipation of one day, hopefully many years down the road, using it. Sometimes in poor Carolyn's case, it had to be used much sooner than anyone would have wished. They could also be available commercially. There was an entire cottage industry of hand sewers who would crank out burial shrouds for purchase on the commercial market. There's a notice of a woman, and this comes from a letter reference from Springfield, Illinois, of a woman who died of consumption when she was 22 years old. And people went to her funeral, and they say that she looked lovely in her shroud of finest white merino, a ruche about her neck, and a veil of tulle fastened at the side with pure white flowers in her hand. So you can see that the burial convention is sort of parallel to the bridal tradition almost. In fact, the letter writer went on to describe her as a bride of death. And so my theory is that Carolyn was actually in a shroud, and we've heard from the letter how a shroud could even incorporate a veil around her head, and that's what people were seeing. Her wedding dress was preserved probably by her mother and then passed on to her brother and descendants. And how was her body so perfectly preserved? And we kind of got into that a little bit. And the key to that is that Fisk burial casket, or cast iron casket. And this was airtight, preventing decay. And this was sort of a new thing that came about in the 19th century, and it was created for the purpose of transporting bodies over distances. It was heavy, but it worked. Actually, Zachary Taylor was buried in a Fisk burial case. So this is likely what Caroline's casket would have looked like. And you can see that about 10-inch long faceplate. It would have had an iron cover that could have been slid away, and then you can kind of gaze at the face. And I wasn't sure how well they worked, but the stories from the 1930s that she looked, perfectly preserved kind of gives an indication that if there's hermetic sealing, I guess it worked pretty well. These were ultimately sort of supplanted by the rise of embalming, and this kind of took off at the time of the Civil War, when you have tens of thousands of people who are passing away far from home and families who want to retrieve bodies. And so the embalming industry kind of crops up to fill that need to preserve bodies for transport home. So this is that time when I'm going to come and tell you about the other thing that that wonderful descendant said. Not only did she supply a photo of Caroline Sutherland and information about her, but she also said that she had Caroline's trunk full of some of her clothing, and she was willing to donate it to the museum. And I can't tell you how exciting this is. This is kind of like a jackpot in terms of a museum curator. This almost never happens, that this obscure person that you feel lucky just to even find them in the census, all of a sudden you found someone who has more of their belongings and can flesh out the story and flesh out the collection. So when this woman arrived with her trunk, she didn't donate the trunk, sadly, but she did donate the contents of the trunk. It was like Christmas morning, seeing what kind of Caroline's things that we were going to receive. So I'm going to take you through the objects in our small but important Caroline Sutherland collection and kind of talk us through what each means about her. This is all we have. We don't have any of her diaries. We don't have any of the letters she wrote. We barely know anything. So the picture that we're able to paint of this woman really comes through her clothing. And this is where material culture can be so powerful, because we are really able to get insight into this woman who died so long ago through the handful of things that she left behind. So we'll start with the wedding dress. This, of course, was in our collection. And this tells us right off the bat that Caroline, well, first of all, was tiny. Look at that waist. But second of all, it confirms what we knew, that she came from this very prosperous family. A white wedding dress was a luxury at the time. And most women of the time, like Mary Fanschmidt Lim of also of Rockford, Illinois, were married in their best dresses. So this is Mary Lim's dress from 1852, just 2 years before Caroline Sutherland's. And this was a very nice dress. It's a silk dress, but it reflects the convention that was popular at the time of women getting married in a dress that they could use again. White was a luxurious fabric, and it was really hard to maintain, especially a white silk dress. If you drag it on the ground and stain the hem, if you spill on it, it's really hard to keep clean and pristine. This kind of dress is much more practical, and women in this time wore their wedding dresses again. It wasn't a one and done thing. Fabric was expensive. The labor invested into a dress was time consuming or expensive if you hired out. So it would be the height of decadence to commission a beautiful, expensive dress and pack it away, never to wear it again. So women wore them again. And what's more, they would alter them to keep fashionable. You would maybe add some ribbons or bows, or you would change the shape of the bodice a little bit, and you would kind of tweak that dress for years to come, so you could kind of keep it in rotation. White was elite at the time. It was expensive. It was kind of the trend. You were on the cutting edge. And so here are a couple images. One is a 19th century woodcut on the right. On the left, we have an image of, let me recall her name, Martha Pickman Rogers of Boston, who got married in 1850. And I love both of these images because they show how Caroline would have styled her dress. She probably would have worn some flowers to augment it, probably pinned right to the center of her bodice there, maybe even some around her waist, or pinned to her skirt as well. But flowers were incredibly popular, especially because it would have been June when she got married, and particularly orange blossoms. Orange blossoms symbolized purity, chastity, and innocence. And because the orange plant is one of the few that will produce blooms and fruit at the same time, it's also considered a symbol of fruitfulness. And then, as we can see with these women, Caroline probably also would have worn a lace veil. And the lace veil, there are a couple of theories, and I don't know how much these hold water, but I'll share them with you because they're kind of fun. One theory is that the lace wedding veil became popular because George Washington's, I believe it's granddaughter, Nellie Custis, when she saw her fiancé, she was standing at a window with a lace curtain panel, and she kind of turned, and he saw her with the lace curtain kind of over her head, and she looked so beautiful, and it was such a romantic moment that she wanted to recapture that for her wedding. There's another tradition that talks about lace veils or veils in general going back to the days of arranged marriages, where you would sort of cover up the bride's face until the deed was done and the groom couldn't back out again. And, you don't show the goods until you've sealed the deal, basically. Like I said, I don't know if any of those are true, but those are kind of both the urban legends surrounding why a person might wear a veil or not. And the rest of what we have, I think you could argue, are pieces of Caroline's trousseau. And so a bridal trousseau is essentially all the clothing and soft goods that a woman would need for the first few years of her marriage. It's like starting her married life with a parcel of goods. And by soft goods, I mean things like bed linens and sheets and towels and things like that. And so female family members, the engaged bride-to-be, sometimes even friends, were pulled in the days and weeks before a wedding, and they would just hang out together, and they would sew, and they would outfit the bride with what she would need for her married life. And the exact contents of this trousseau really vary depending on a family's financial means and how long the engagement and how much time they had to sew. But one etiquette manual of the 19th century suggested that a trousseau contain 12 chemises, which is your foundation garment, 12 drawers, 12 nightdresses, 6 corset covers, 4 corsets, 12 heavy cotton pairs of stockings, 12 fine thread stockings, 12 petticoats, 12 under petticoats, 12 flannel petticoats, 4 dressing gowns, 2 wrappers, 24 handkerchiefs, 8 to 16 pairs of gloves, 30 handkerchiefs, and then a woman's outfit, which would be 2 morning dresses, 2 afternoon dresses, 2 walking suits, 2 evening dresses, 1 traveling dress, 1 waterproof suit. Obviously, that's all didn't fit in that trunk there, and not everyone had as many multiples as was suggested, but it gives you an idea of the types of things that would have comprised a trousseau. And I love this detail because I get asked a lot how many clothes a woman might have owned in the 19th century. And I know the general answer is far fewer than today. Again, clothing was a real investment of time and money to make, and they didn't have fast fashion like we did today. People made their garments, mended them, made them over, reused them. But I love that this spells out, she enumerates 10 outfits. So 10 is sort of an ideal that not all women would have had, but probably Caroline did have that since her family was fairly well off. So going through the contents, everything going forward is what showed up with the donor and was a thrill to unpack. So the first thing she showed us were a pair of chemises, which is wonderful. This is a foundational garment. This is something that women are going to wear closest to the skin. Laundry in the 19th century is not the same as today. There's no gentle cycle. There's no woolite. If you're going to clean something, it involves throwing it in a tub of scalding water and scrubbing the heck out of it with lye soap. So you want to do that to something that can stand up to it. So these chemises are worn closest to the body to absorb dirt and sweat and oils off your person. So your wool dress or your silk dress or your outer garment doesn't have to. And the best chemises were of linen, and linen gets so soft when it's washed. It can really take that rough scrubbing treatment. And so here's where there's kind of a moment of trepidation, because I had this wonderful donor who said that she had Caroline Sutherland's clothing, but how can you really tell? And it's a challenge with material objects. Sometimes it's not like a letter where someone signed it or you could identify handwriting. With clothing, oftentimes you kind of have to go on someone's word. This could be Caroline's clothing, or it could have been someone else's clothing, which I would have been happy with, but you kind of want to know. And in this case, again, we got so lucky because Caroline's items bear her laundry mark. And so they're literally stamped with her name, C.A. Sutherland. And a laundry mark is essentially the equivalent of writing your name in your underpants with a Sharpie marker. If you're going away to summer camp, it is a way to keep track of all your garments when they're in the wash. So if you picture Caroline's household here, she's got a mom and a sister-in-law all living under one roof. And so in laundry day, you might have each of them throwing 5 or 6 chemises into the boiling pot. So you stamp it with your name so you know that once the laundry is cleaned and dried, you're going to get back the items that belong to you. And so literally Caroline's name is on these objects, which is just such a home run and so neat to be able to confirm that they did belong to her. The next item are this wonderful pair of Balbriggan hose. Balbriggan was a stocking factory in Ireland, so these were imported Irish stockings. They are of a fine cotton that were hand embroidered with this beautiful design. These were probably, if not her wedding stockings, then they were special occasion stockings for sure. And the reason I know that is not because of the embroidery. As beautiful as it was, people did have everyday stockings that were embroidered on the foot and up the shin bone like that. And this is in case, your skirts happen to tip up, you might get a sensuous peek at this beautiful embroidery. Now I can tell that these are special occasion stockings by looking at the toe and the heel. And let's compare it. This is a pair of stockings worn by Isabel Hatch of Illinois. And these are her everyday stockings. And you can tell because you can see how much mending they have. They're soiled at the heel and toe. They've got mending on top of mending. So everyday stockings take abuse and are mended frequently. These are a pair of stockings that were probably only worn once, maybe a handful of times, and they were packed away, probably for a special occasion for Caroline that never came. She might have planned to wear her wedding dress again or planned to go to a fancy ball again, and it just didn't happen to her because of the course that her life took. And the clothing that we'll look at as we go through this trousseau is kind of going to illuminate the arc that her life took. So the next thing is this apron, and this is a cool item too because it's so utilitarian. There is nothing fancy about this. This is a linen apron. It was still actually like crispy from the starch. It was a convention to dip some white goods in starch to kind of give them that smooth, flat look, and you could still feel it crinkle under your fingertips as you hold it. And you can see that it's clearly been stained. This is a used garment. And so we have Caroline, who started as a bride and with her silk wedding dress and her lovely embroidered chemise that was sewn as part of her trousseau. And this is an object that speaks to her role as a young housekeeper. She's in Illinois now. She's not in her brother and mother's household. There are no domestic servants probably to help her out. If she was lucky, she might have had one. She doesn't have the female support system, and so she would have been working in her house, and probably harder than she was used to, frankly. A young woman being brought up in a house where her mother is living is expected to contribute. She's expected to learn how to sew, to learn how to cook, to learn how to keep house, but she's not the one responsible for it. She's still got her mom, and in Caroline's case, her sister-in-law to lean on. When she's in Illinois all by herself, it's her. If there's dinner going to get on the table, it's because she does it. She's got to clean the stove. She's got to make her husband's shirts and keep the laundry clean. And so this apron is her working to create a nice household for her husband and anticipation of the future children that they would have together. So this is kind of that counterpoint to her Troy Female Seminary education, which prepared her intellectually for the role of being a wife and a helpmeet to her husband, but it didn't negate the need for her to roll up her sleeves and get down and dirty keeping house. And after a short time as being a young housekeeper and bride, we've got a new event coming into Carolyn's life. And that event is kind of makes itself known in this petticoat. Looking at it, you see the waist. This is a pre-pregnancy petticoat. This is something that she wore in her days as a belle of Chatham Center, or perhaps she even wore it under her wedding dress. It's got that tiny waist. But if you look closely at it, you see not only her laundry mark, but you see a little string extender. And what she's doing here is lengthening her waistline, because her waistline's expanding, because Caroline is now expecting a baby, and the baby is due almost exactly a year after her wedding. So another change to this young woman's life. She's already moved across the country, settled in, assumed the role of a housekeeper, and now she's got her changing body and her changing role in life. Another reflection of this, a subtle one, is her collection of caps. So I'm fairly certain that the two on the top are day caps. The bottom two might both be nightcaps. Certainly the one on the bottom right is probably a nightcap. It's less sheer. It's kind of more a little bit utilitarian. A nightcap is used just kind of like how it sounds. It's used to keep the head warm at night. It's used to kind of keep your hair under control so it doesn't get tangled. And it's also used in case you put any kind of oils or whatever in your hair so you don't gunk up your pillow. A day cap is a convention of, this is out of fashion by the time Caroline is getting married and starting out on her own. And so a day cap is really an in the house kind of thing. And I'll show you an image of who's wearing day caps. This is a photo from the late 1840s down there. And you can see all the younger people have their hair nicely done. The only person who's letting themselves be seen in a day cap is the matriarch, the older woman to the center. So by the time Carolyn is a young wife, it's not really the style for her to be going out and about in this day cap. What this indicates is that she's sticking closer to home. And again, this reflects back on her pregnancy. As her figure expands, she's going to stay closer and closer to home because it becomes less socially acceptable for her to be going out in public. And a day cap is sort of the equivalent of like a life hack for a bad hair day, let's say. It's something you don't need to do your hair up in a fancy style. You just kind of smooth it back and put on this day cap and call it a day. And look at Caroline before her marriage here. She's got the full-on 1850s poofy hair ringlet. I mean, this is a woman who does her hair and knows how to do her hair. So if she was going out and about, certainly she would be styling her hair according to the latest fashion. Her day caps show us that she's not. She's staying close to home as her figure expands, and her social circle and world is kind of shrinking accordingly. We have two of her nightgowns, and what's wonderful about these is that they're not just nightgowns, or they might properly be considered wrappers since they button all the way down. This is an at-home garment, and they are clearly created to accommodate a pregnant figure. And sometimes you can't tell when you're looking at the one on the left and it's just laying on a table. You're like, huh. Once you put it on a mannequin and sort of try to simulate a real figure inside it, you can see like, okay, it's clearly meant to accommodate a baby bump here. And in the 19th century, there's no such thing as ready-made clothing at all. And maternity wear isn't really its own category of clothing too. What women do is they take their existing garments and they alter them to accommodate a pregnancy. So this goes for your night clothes and for your everyday garments. You might let out a waist. You might let out some darts. You might add a drawstring. You're going to change that garment to suit your body. And then after you deliver, you're going to change it back. Your clothing is constantly being altered to reflect the the state of your figure. And so maternity clothes are actually quite rare in museum collections because they don't stay maternity clothes. Oftentimes they get turned back into regular clothes after the woman's done with her childbearing. These garments really only survive to us because Caroline didn't have that chance, because she died in childbirth and left her maternity nightgowns behind. And so this one, this is an intriguing garment, and this came to us from the donor, whose theory is that the brown spots that you see are blood stains on this nightgown, and that Caroline was actually wearing this when she went into labor. And so you're seeing kind of the blood of childbearing on it. I can't confirm this one way or the other, and I went so far as to reach out to our local police and to our state police and say, hey, can you do some tests on this garment to determine if these stains are actually blood? And both of them came back with kind of like, sorry, we don't do that. You know, our resources are stretched thin. We've got to save them for crimes and things, which I appreciate. That's fair. But it does leave me wondering what these stains are on the garment. And I don't think that blood necessarily is out of the question. And so here we have, you know, this woman at the end of her life, and we might actually be viewing a garment where her life's blood is slipping away. She fights to hang on to this world and to deliver her child with her mother by her side. And then the last garment is Carolyn's drawers, and they kind of serve as a postscript to her life. And drawers are a part of the under costume. You put on your chemise, and the next thing on were your drawers. These came into fashion about the 1830s. Oftentimes they were split in the middle for ease of using the restroom. And what's interesting about these, I've never seen this before as a curator, they have Caroline's laundry mark. But if you look closely, the CA has been crossed out and MH has been written in. And remember, Mary Holst Sutherland was Carolyn's sister-in-law. So what happened was, after Caroline passed away, her sister-in-law nicked her drawers and appropriated them for her own, which to our modern sensibilities seems like a bridge too far. You know, just use your own underwear, Mary. Putting ourselves back in the 19th century frame of mind, Mary would have been making her own garments by hand, as most women did, and there's a lot of labor in it. This probably would have been a solid 8 to 10 hours of sewing if she had created a pair of drawers for her own use. And so she probably said, okay, there's Caroline sitting in that trunk over there. She's not using them anymore. That will save me a day's work of my life. And yoink, she took them and made them her own. So we have the end of Caroline's life and some of her garments being taken for use by other family members. And so really what we have is this, again, it's a small collection, and it's certainly not everything Caroline owned by a long stretch. It's not everything she took to Illinois with her, but it gives us enough to chart the arc of her life from this beautiful, young, well-educated young woman who marries and sets off to her new life, the challenges she endures as a new housekeeper who's rolling up her sleeves, doing the hard labor of keeping a 19th century house going, the excitement that comes as she kind of evolves from this, you know, young belle into a woman who's expecting a child. Her figure is changing accordingly. She's got this whole new life to look forward to. Her social circle constricts as she stays closer to home in anticipation of her arriving child. Her wardrobe changes. She wears these loose-fitting garments. And at the end of her life, like so many women in the 19th century, she died in childbirth. She was a maternal mortality statistic, died with her mom by her side, her mom who had come out to help her with the arrival of the child and wound up taking her body and her belongings back east to be buried, and the belongings got packed away, all except for the pair of drawers that Mary took. And so these garments really reveal the life of so many women, because so many women did die in childbirth, and so many women are footnotes to history who died, and maybe their husbands remarried, and we really kind of only know them from names on tombstones. But at least with Caroline, we know a little bit about her, and we can feel a little bit for her and all that happened to her in this exciting and dynamic and ultimately fatal portion of her young life. And so now I am happy to stop for questions, and I did include my email address. If you want more information outside of this presentation, please don't hesitate to email me. I love questions about things like these.
Well, we don't want you to stop sharing because the story is fantastic. My goodness, thank you so much. What a fascinating way to look at garments and look at clothing and, and at customs of a very particular period of history that are so very different from our own today. Really, really interesting. We have a lot of interest. Our audience is really passionate, lots of shares about their own weddings and so on. And I encourage you to put your questions in the chat box. A couple of questions that came in already. Michelle asks you about your education, and if you would give us kind of a summary of the differences of a curator versus a conservator.
Awesome. Yeah, great question. Thank you. So I have a bachelor's degree in history and English from Illinois Wesleyan University and a master's degree in early American culture from the Winterthur program, which is through the University of Delaware. And in my graduate program, they really encouraged and supported the study of material culture through hands-on exploration. So we were at the Winterthur Museum in Delaware, and we studied with the curators to learn about textiles and paintings and metals and furniture and just kind of get a sense of the material world that people lived in. And one of the things they kept encouraging us to do was to read objects as text, to look at a historic object and kind of take a step back and think like, what caused this to be made? Why was it made this way? Why is it this color? Why is it made with these materials? And sort of interrogate objects to see what they can tell you about themselves. And when you do that, you really kind of start to pick up all these nonverbal but very significant things that our objects and even our surroundings say to us. A curator is someone who interprets objects for the good of the cause, let's say. So in my daily job, I create exhibits of objects. I give presentations like these. If time permits, I do scholarship, but that's kind of, there's always something more pressing that keeps me from just nerding out in the library. A conservator is much more of a scientist. So a conservator is someone who is going to keep the object stable or in some cases restore it as closely as possible to its original condition. And these are people I have the highest respect for. It's a challenging program of preparation because you have to really know things like chemistry and physics and science and all that, as well as have a firm grasp of art and history. And so it's really, people are using two sides of their brain.
Very, very, and thank you for sharing that. Michelle also asks if ever the shroud and the wedding gown would be made of the same fabric, since they were made at the same time.
Probably not. You're probably going to use linen or cotton. I would say a shroud is more, well, you know what? Nope, I take that back, because that one quote I read to you talked about there being a merino shroud, and a merino is a type of fine wool, and that was an acceptable fabric for a wedding gown. So yes, let's say yes, they could have been.
We're going to go with yes. Lots of interest from our audience around the coffin. And Helen asked if Abraham Lincoln was also buried in an iron casket, if you know that.
I do know that because I live in Springfield, Illinois, and we just
I
had
was
a big,
thinking you might, yeah.
yeah, we had a big reenaction of Lincoln's funeral about 5 or 6 years ago. No, Lincoln was not. And so my sense is for that iron casket to work, you have to seal it and it's airtight and then it stays closed. And if you want to see the deceased, it's through the faceplate. Lincoln had this multi-stop, multi-day funeral where he was taken to all the cities on the way west back to Illinois. And they actually brought out his casket, opened it up, and showed it so people could come by. So Lincoln was embalmed. Maybe he was the first president to be embalmed. I'm not sure. But he was embalmed, and there are these kind of like ghoulish notes of he traveled with one of the embalmers, and the embalmer would kind of keep chalking his face as the funeral procession went on because it's not a perfect science, and his face was kind of starting to get discolored by the time that he got to Springfield. So he was an early and imperfect case of embalming.
I need a little touch up along the way.
He did, yeah.
Another question around the casket comes from Lee, and that is the cost of a Fisk casket. Do you have an idea of what the cost was then or what the equivalent would be now?
I don't know in terms of money and translation to today. I do know that it was a high-end item. It would have been expensive. And so this is something for the affluent to use. It wasn't an everyday thing by any stretch of the imagination. And if anyone's interested in iron caskets, there's a documentary floating out there called The Woman in the Iron Coffin. And there was an iron casket actually turned up during excavation in New York, and research was done. And again, the body was very well preserved. The clothing was very well preserved. And it turned out to be an African-American woman who was living and working in the household of someone connected to the iron casket factory. And so she was probably buried in one of their samples. Again, it's called The Woman in the Iron Coffin, and just really fascinating. Highly encourage watching it.
Sounds really fascinating. Susan asks if you have a theory as to where the rest of Caroline's clothes went, and if Mary might have borrowed more than the drawers, or what typically in stories like this, where would you surmise that the group of clothes would end up?
That is a great question. And so, yes, it's actually, I think, unusual that her clothes were set aside like that. I think they probably, in typical cases, would have been appropriated. Probably the drawer thing would have been the typical case, and the, setting aside and packing up in a trunk and not using was atypical, especially, this woman died in 1854 and here's a trunk of her clothes in, 2019. That's unheard of. So yeah, I think they probably, Mary would have taken them all, or the mom would have taken them, or, a daughter or granddaughter would have found them in the attic and played dress up with them, and any of that could have happened. So yeah, the real miracle is that handful survived untouched as they did.
I'm curious, along this journey, you said that there were some wonderful things that, revealed themselves and so on. What would you say is the most surprising bit of research?
Pertaining to Caroline, or just to
Exactly.
Clothing in general?
Caroline's story. What would you say, what surprised you the most?
I think it's sort of it's an aggregate of how many wins there were, the fact that we located a descendant who knew something about her, the fact that she had this clothing in her possession, the fact that she was willing to donate it, the fact that she showed up and it was marked with her name, that actually confirmed that it belonged to Caroline and just wasn't some old clothes that she had and might have. And then the crossing out of the laundry mark, I've never seen that. And it's one thing where you surmise that, like, okay, after death, probably your clothes would have been used by someone else, but there's like actual physical evidence. So it was just this win of getting the total package of these clothes that survive, that tell this wonderful story all together.
When you unearth something like a trunk of these clothes, would you walk us through, the process in-house as to, like, it is dropped off, it's decided that the museum is interested, and then what happens?
Then we look at them and just basically look at them very carefully. And so with the chemise was the first thing to come out. And one thing I'm looking at right off the bat is, like, is this the right time period? Like, is it, are they hand stitched? Is it the right material? Does it have the right look? Because if something's off, then it's like, well, this probably isn't what you think it is. And that happens, family stories aren't perfect, right? We get actually a lot of people wanting to donate furniture that Lincoln sat on or has a Lincoln connection, right? And their tradition is Lincoln came through and sat in this chair, and it's just not right. Like, this is an 1880s chair. There's no way Lincoln could have sat in it. So just the visual analysis of, like, does this fit what the story purports it to fit is important. So I would have taken it based on, it looked 1850s without the laundry mark, but the laundry mark was just like, okay, game over. This is what it is. And then after that, I work with the collections manager, and she's the detail-oriented one, and I'm the, big picture one. We work well together. She looks at condition, like, is this thing falling apart? Is it stable? How do we need to store this? How do we need to make sure that it's preserved? I'm kind of like, yeah, okay, whatever, what's on to the next thing, what's next, but that is part of responsible museum curation, is like assessing the physical condition and making sure that you can store it properly.
Chris asks, perfect timing, how is clothing stored and preserved?
So we store it. We have a climate-controlled textiles vault where the temperature hovers around 66 degrees and the humidity is set somewhere around 40%. This is what keeps clothes happy. They like to be in the dark, so unless we're working with them, the lights are always off in there. Light is brutal to fabrics, and light damage is cumulative. So the more precious something is, the less you want it out in any kind of direct light. And then it's best to store them flat in an acid-free box with layers of acid-free tissue paper between them.
Lori asks, lots of questions are coming in. How was the laundry mark made?
People had a couple options. Earlier, like in the 18th and early 19th centuries, it was often embroidered. So embroidery wasn't just a decorative skill. It was actually like a practical skill that you would use to mark your household linens. By the middle of the 19th century, you see Carolyn has like a stencil. So these were things that you could buy at a stationer's. You could commission your name on a stencil. And then oftentimes people used indelible ink as well.
My last question today, and I'm sorry we were out of time, but my next question is, what are you working on now? What is next for you and the Illinois State Museum?
So I'm going to go in a little bit different direction from 19th century women's fashion. We're going to do an exhibit on growing up Gen X. So I happen to be at the tail end of Gen X myself. We're the sandwich generation between the boomers and the millennials. Nobody ever pays attention to us, but I'm going to right that wrong. So we're going to, gather up the Apple IIe computers and the Nintendos and the scrunchies and leg warmers and show what kind of toys and technology and the cultural touchstones that shaped a generation.
And when can we expect this?
This will be in about a year. So fall of 2022, that should be opening.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, Erica, I want to thank you on behalf of the National Arts Club and our fabulous audience for joining us today and sharing the tragic story of a very interesting woman. And I also want to say that if you'd like to look at other videos from the National Arts Club, you can go to our YouTube channel. You can also visit us at nationalartsclub.org or find us on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter. Thank you for joining us. I'm David Zyla.
Thanks so much.